The livestock auction had nearly ended. Only one pen remained. 72 tiny piglets huddled together in the corner. They were painfully thin. Their ribs showed. Most buyers walked past without slowing down. The auctioneer glanced toward the crowd. Last lot. He sighed. 72 crossbred piglets. He looked down at the paperwork. Owners surrendered after feed ran out. Silence. One rancher whispered. They'll cost more to save than they're worth. Another nodded. Someone should just put them down. Margaret Hale watched the piglets. Not one of them fought. They simply stood together, waiting. Nathan leaned closer. You've already decided. She nodded. I have. The auctioneer tried again. $21 for the group? Nobody moved. Margaret quietly raised her hand. I'll take them. The room turned. Dale Harper stared. $21? Margaret smiled. They've already survived the hardest part. 3 strikes of the gavel echoed to the sale barn. The piglets belonged to her. Outside, Nathan opened the trailer. They're in rough shape. Margaret knelt beside the smallest piglet. It cautiously sniffed her hand. We'll fix that. Back at the Hale Ranch, recovery came first. Warm bedding, small meals several times a day, electrolytes, fresh water, quiet shelter. The veterinarian visited every other day. Within 2 weeks, tails curled, ears perked up. The piglets began racing one another around the paddock. Nathan laughed. I don't recognize them. Margaret smiled. They finally feel safe. Most people believed the story ended there. It hadn't even begun. When Margaret was 14, Samuel Hale walked with her through an abandoned creek bottom during a particularly dry summer. The surrounding hills looked brown. Grass crunched beneath every step. Margaret pointed toward the cracked creek bed. It dried up. Samuel smiled. Did it? She looked confused. There isn't any water. He knelt and brushed loose leaves aside. Dark damp soil appeared. Then he pushed his walking stick into the ground. Water slowly seeped into the hole. Margaret stared. It was underneath. Samuel nodded. Some creeks hide. She looked around. How do you find them? He smiled. Watch animals. Years later, Margaret attended a soil and watershed restoration workshop. A hydrologist explained that many historic spring-fed creeks become buried beneath decades of silt, leaves, invasive roots, and sediment rather than actually disappearing. The speaker showed photographs of pigs accidentally uncovering buried springs while rooting for food. Margaret wrote one sentence across the top of her notebook. Animals often remember landscapes people forget. Now 72 healthy piglets needed somewhere to grow. The county heard almost immediately. Naturally. Saturday morning the diner bust. Dale Harper folded his newspaper. You hear what Margaret bought. Rick looked up. What this time? 72 starving piglets. Several farmers laughed. The little skeletons. Dale nodded. Paid $21. Another rancher shook his head. Feed alone will bankrupt her. Margaret walked inside carrying mineral supplements. Dale waved. Morning. Morning. He smiled. So. She laughed. So. How are the bargain pigs? They're eating. More laughter. What are they good for? Margaret smiled. I don't know yet. Nobody believed that answer. 3 months later, the piglets had become strong young hogs. Not enormous. Healthy. Curious. Always rooting. Margaret loaded them into trailers before sunrise. Nathan looked over the map. You really think this is the place? The property bordered an abandoned valley below the eastern ridge. Old aerial photographs showed a winding creek decades earlier. Modern maps showed only a dry drainage. Locals simply called it Dry Hollow. Margaret nodded. Water doesn't usually disappear. The valley floor had become packed with decades of leaves. Dense brush. Blackberry thickets. Young trees. Deep layers of silt washed down from surrounding hills. If a creek still existed, it was buried. Portable fencing divided the valley into rotational paddocks. Nathan opened the trailer. The young hogs exploded into the brush. Instead of eating grass, they immediately began rooting through soft soil beneath the leaf litter. Powerful snouts lifted roots. Turned compost. Exposed darker earth below. Nathan watched. They're digging everywhere. Margaret smiled. They're looking for dinner. Every few days the hogs moved into fresh sections. The first month looked messy. Then something unexpected happened. Small wet patches appeared. Not puddles. Seats. The soil remained damp even without rain. The extension watershed specialist visited 6 weeks later. He slowly walked across one freshly rooted section. He knelt, pressed his hand against the ground. It's saturated. Margaret smiled. We haven't had rain. He looked surprised. I know. He pushed a small soil probe into the earth. Only a few inches down. Water filled the hole. Nathan grinned. Something's underneath. Samuel had once written nearly the same observation. Dry ground tells only half the story. Dig deeper. The hogs certainly did. As autumn approached, they rooted through thicker deposits of leaves and old flood sediment. One afternoon, Nathan noticed an unusually straight depression running across the valley. He called Margaret. Come here. She brushed away loose soil. Smooth, rounded stones. Not random. They formed a narrow, winding line. What do you think? Nathan asked. Margaret smiled. A creek. They followed the stones another 100 yards. More appeared. The watershed specialist returned carrying historic survey maps. He spread one across the tailgate. There it is. Nathan leaned closer. Hidden Creek. The specialist nodded. It supplied 3 farms until the 1950s. What happened? Floods. He traced another line. Sediment gradually buried the channel. Margaret looked toward the rooting hogs. They've been following it. The specialist smiled. They're uncovering history. Each week another section of the ancient creek bed emerged. Rounded gravel. Smooth limestone. Old stream bends. Native wetland plants immediately appeared wherever sunlight reached the moist ground. Frogs returned. Dragonflies hovered over tiny pools. Then one cool October morning, Nathan walked into the newest paddock before sunrise. The hogs had rooted heavily overnight. He stopped. Clear water trickled across freshly exposed gravel. Not rainwater. It flowed steadily. He called Margaret. She hurried down the valley. Neither of them spoke. The tiny stream continued flowing. Crystal clear. Cold. Constant. The watershed specialist arrived an hour later. He watched quietly, measured the flow, then smiled. I've got a question. Margaret folded her arms. Go ahead. He looked at the newly flowing creek winding through the valley. Do you realize this spring-fed stream may have been underground for more than 50 years? The watershed specialist crouched beside the newly exposed stream. He dipped a thermometer into the water. Then he looked toward Margaret. Do you realize this spring-fed stream may have been underground for more than 50 years? Margaret watched the clear current slip quietly over smooth gravel. I knew something was feeding the valley. The specialist smiled. It wasn't just feeding it. He stood. It never stopped flowing. Nathan looked surprised. Even during drought. The specialist nodded. This isn't rainwater. He pointed toward the hillside. It's groundwater. The stream had never disappeared. Decades of floods had slowly buried the channel beneath layers of leaves, silt, fallen branches, and invasive roots. Water simply kept moving underneath. The hogs had unknowingly peeled away years of accumulated debris. The restoration began carefully. No bulldozers entered the valley. No excavators reshaped the banks. The hogs continued rotating through fresh paddocks, rooting out compacted sediment, while workers stabilized the newly exposed stream banks with native grasses and willow cuttings. The county conservation office approved every step. They wanted the creek restored, not rebuilt. Within weeks, the water flowed more freely. Native gravel bars appeared. Small riffles returned. Deep pools formed where the old channel naturally widened. The fisheries biologist visited during early spring. He walked slowly along the creek. Suddenly he stopped. Look! Tiny fish darted beneath an undercut bank. Margaret smiled. What are that? He knelt. Darters. He looked farther upstream. And juvenile creek chuds. Nathan laughed. They've been here this whole time. The biologist nodded. They've been living underground where the water stayed connected. That spring brought the driest weather in nearly 30 years. Pastures across the valley turned brown. Farm ponds shrank daily. Stock tanks emptied. The county issued voluntary water restrictions. Neighboring ranchers hauled water by truck. Margaret walked down to Hidden Creek. It flowed exactly as it had in October. Clear. Cold. Steady. Nathan looked at the current. It hasn't changed. Margaret smiled. It doesn't depend on rain. Word spread quickly. Dale Harper drove over one hot afternoon. He stood silently beside the creek. I've been hauling water for 3 weeks. Margaret nodded. I heard. He looked at the flowing stream. I laughed at those piglets. You did. I called them worthless. She smiled. They were just hungry. The county commissioner visited the following week. He watched the stream for nearly an hour before speaking. I've got to admit something. Margaret looked over. What? We've spent years searching for emergency drought water. He pointed toward the creek. It was here all along. The conservation department partnered with the Hale Ranch to restore the entire watershed. Old fled debris disappeared. Native trees shaded the banks. Beavers eventually returned to the upper reaches, building small dams that slowed floodwater without blocking the spring flow. Songbirds multiplied. Dragonflies filled the valley. Wildflowers covered the newly stabilized banks. The 72 piglets had unintentionally restored an ecosystem. The old drainage called Dry Hollow quietly vanished from county maps. Its original name returned. Hidden Creek. University researchers soon established long-term monitoring stations. Groundwater levels improved. Summer water temperatures stayed remarkably cool. Native fish populations expanded each season. One hydrology professor smiled after reviewing the data. "You know what's remarkable?" Margaret looked up. "What?" "The creek never failed." He pointed toward the monitoring charts. "People did." She laughed softly. "What do you mean?" "We stopped maintaining the watershed." He looked toward the flowing water. The creek simply waited. One graduate student asked Margaret, "When did you know there was still water underneath?" She thought for a moment. "I didn't." The student looked surprised. "Then why buy the piglets?" She smiled. "They needed a chance. And the creek. I thought it deserved one too." Late that summer, the State Conservation Agency designated Hidden Creek as a watershed restoration demonstration site. Landowners arrived from neighboring counties. Some expected expensive earth-moving equipment. Others expected massive engineering projects. Instead, they watched healthy heritage hogs calmly rooting through carefully managed paddocks, while conservation crews planted native vegetation behind them. The watershed specialist laughed. "This may be the cheapest stream restoration project we've ever documented." Nathan grinned. "The payroll eats corn." Even the local school began bringing students to the property. One little boy watched the hogs rooting happily beneath oak trees. He looked at Margaret. "Did they know the creek was there?" She smiled. "I don't think so." "Then why'd they dig?" "They were looking for food." The boy looked at the flowing stream. "So they found water by accident?" Margaret nodded. "Sometimes that's how the best discoveries happen." The boy smiled. "I like those pigs." "So do I." Years later, the drought of that summer became the one everyone remembered. Neighboring farms eventually recovered. Reservoirs refilled. Rain returned. But Hidden Creek never changed. It flowed through every season exactly as it always had. Clear, cold, reliable. One quiet autumn evening, Margaret sat beside the restored stream. The 72 hogs, now a thriving breeding herd, grazed peacefully beneath scattered sycamores. Dragonflies skimmed the water. Brook trout fingerlings, stocked after habitat improvements, flashed through deep pools. She remembered auction day. Everyone had seen 72 starving piglets. Expense, risk, failure. Margaret had seen life that simply needed another chance. She never expected them to uncover a forgotten spring-fed creek. She never imagined the valley's most dependable water source had been flowing unseen beneath layers of neglect for half a century. She simply believed that animals often understand landscapes better than people give them credit for. By the 5th year, no one referred to it as Dry Hollow anymore. Every county map once again marked Hidden Creek. Ranchers visited to learn rotational hog grazing. Conservation groups studied the restored watershed. School children learned how buried streams could be brought back without tearing apart an entire valley. Every spring, the descendants of those original 72 piglets rooted gently along carefully managed sections of the creek, keeping invasive brush from reclaiming its banks. Margaret always smiled when visitors called the stream the greatest discovery. Because the real treasure had never been the water itself. It was remembering that nature often keeps its greatest gifts alive beneath the surface, waiting patiently for someone willing to notice what everyone else assumes is gone forever.